Sveicināt, mīļie dāmas un kungi! Liels gods jūs uzrunāt Rīgas aviācijas fórumu 2020 ietvaros. Es nevaru izteikt, cik es labprāt būtu kopā ar jums uz vietas, bet situācija ir kāda viņa ir. Tādēļ es daru šo ierakstu no Madrides. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you in Riga Aviation Forum 2020. I was just saying that it was an immense pleasure to be in person, being back in Riga, which is my hometown. Unfortunately, the restrictions that a billion of other people are experiencing in the world also make me to do this video from Madrid. But the subject is quite interesting, and I think it's $1 million question. How will aviation industry look after this crisis? And how long will the crisis last? And I think the question to those, or the answer to those questions is quite nuanced, and it depends on many known and unknown factors. And I wish I could give you a more specific answer. We have looked into it, but it's like having a crystal ball. You know? So our chief economist team was looking in the question, and we are actually looking at a number of various scenarios. You know, like what would be scenarios for industry recovery, what would airline operation look like, and obviously how the behavior of our consumers will happen. I'd like to look at the current state of the industry. And before we dig into it, it's actually quite impossible to describe the magnitude of those crises. We have never seen something similar. I'm sure all the presentations that you will see today will talk about a similar effect. And in aviation, obviously, we are measuring our efficiency in RPKs, which stands for revenue passenger kilometers. And IATA estimates that in 2020, RPKs will fall 50% compared to 2019. This is unprecedented. We haven't seen anything of this magnitude before. And we have to remember that first, this is a health crisis, and that the policies that the governments have implemented is based on the zero risk. Obviously, you know, we don't want to risk health disasters. So the restrictions have been also unprecedented, which basically has made for our industry impossible to operate. If you look at slide 5, it's actually an ICAO slide, you can see how the development of different crises has done in history. So we are talking about the period from 1945 till today. You see that in 2020, the fall hasn't happened in the world. So obviously that has enormous toll to our members and to industry, and also to the global economies. And in response to this global crisis or health crisis, governments have implemented very stringent restrictions. And you see that many countries stay closed, fully closed, or partially closed. And even within the EU, you know, where borders are open between the member states, states decide to make very drastic decisions by closing the borders or implementing mandatory quarantine, where people wishing to travel need to stay 14 days in isolation, which makes sense from the risk management perspective, but it completely kills demand, and there's basically no traffic. Let us have a look at different scenarios for recovery. Start with, let's see how GDP could possibly develop. Our economics team have worked with two projections. One is based on a little bit more positive, and other is a little more negative scenario. And in case of positive, we assume that there are effective testing systems in place, that there are vaccines, that obviously are very important for giving passengers confidence to travel, get on the plane, go somewhere else. And in positive scenario, we project that GDP could start recovery somewhere in 2021, whereas a more negative scenario is based on assumptions that there is a second wave of infections during winter 2020, which will be detrimental for the economy and obviously for the aviation as well. And considering those both scenarios, there are two very important factors for aviation industry to recover. First one is solving the biorisk problem along the passenger journey. And this all is about confidence, because COVID is a health crisis. And as long as people will be feeling unsafe to travel, they will not start traveling. And if we cannot demonstrate that aviation is not spreading the virus, actually we have done already as an industry a good job of proving that the chances of infection on board the aircraft is limited. So it's really safe to travel. What we have to ensure is that we're not spreading it by transporting sick people. And obviously vaccines, testing are crucially important to ensure that. And the other one, which is very, very important, is how soon and how effective restrictions are managed when countries are opening up. And there could also be a number of scenarios which could take place. In one scenario, countries could open up in coordinated manner following ICAO CART guidance, and CART stands for Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, which consists of international aviation stakeholders and organizations, basically agreeing on common risk measures. Another scenario could be when countries opt to create travel bubbles, which we see in some states in Europe as well. Basically, those would be bilateral agreements with their partner countries. And yet another possible scenario would be for some countries to open borders in multilateral manner, therefore leading to reopening of regional markets. In this case, we have lots of hopes for EC as a coordinated body, but we see also that this is much more challenging in Europe because countries are still within the EU imposing different measures. As we can also see, that is the case here in Latvia, which has been very effective in tackling COVID crisis. And with those two factors, obviously, there are scenarios and factors that would shape, the recovery. One is confidence. I already spoke about that. Speed, how countries will lift the restrictions, because slower it will take place, slower the recovery will be. Government policy in response to stimulus packages. Grateful for, particularly in Europe, that there are many states that have given aid to airlines, including Latvia as well. We have to be very careful as how we manage conditions that comes with those state aids, and those should be carefully considered in order not to basically suffer in the future. And lastly, I'd like to remind all of us about the extremely complex ecosystem that aviation has. And with number of suppliers, number of vendors, very complex value chain. It is very sensitive to any changes. And that's why we believe that even if economies would recover faster, then aviation would probably not be able to recover as soon because of this complex environment where we are in at. And while the industry is dealing with those changing environment, we believe that it might look different in future, be it through the number of liquidations, mergers, or nationalizations in some cases. Another crucially important part for recovery scenarios are the behaviors of our passengers, so consumer behavior. And to start with, let's look at the demand forecast for next 5 years to see how this is developing. And actually, there is quite a challenging task ahead of us, because in the first part of 2020, air travel is down by 58.4%, which is almost 60%. We believe that the recovery will start with the passengers who would be visiting their families and friends, basically for the personal reasons. And I can totally relate to that because I will go to Latvia to see my parents as well. As soon as restrictions are lifted, as soon as I'm free to travel, that we believe will be general behavior, which will be segmented as well. But there is still a lot of uncertainty, which you see in the yellow part, because basically how, again, we are managing the bio-risks and confidence to travel. So once again, looking at the yellow part, we see that the demand could return to 2019 levels somewhere in 2023. Looking more closely at the behaviors we can expect from consumers in short term, let's say 2 years, we believe that business travel will reduce or recover much, much slower because mainly of technological adoption, such as teleconferencing or video conferencing, or messages this. Although we do not really believe that this could substitute the personal contact in the longer term, but for the obvious cost reasons, maybe as a temporarily good solution on a shorter term. Whereas we see that leisure travel most probably recover faster for the reasons I just mentioned, which is basically people wanting to see their families and friends again. We know that there are huge community of people that are actually living outside their original countries, not only in Europe, I mean globally. And an important message here again is that the uncertainty could play a very, very important role. So that comes back to my previous message about how well are we able to manage the risks of biosecurity. And in the same manner, when we speak about domestic and international travel, it is most likely that the domestic travel might rebound faster, which could be the factors such as income, spending, and in case of Air Baltic is a good example for regional travel. So it's domestic regional will recover faster, whereas we currently see in Europe that intercontinental travel doesn't exist at all at the moment. So we also believe that in a little bit longer term, this will recover much, much, much slower than domestic and regional. And on long-term, consumer behaviors will depend on income recovery, which obviously will lead to recovery of air travel for all segments, especially since demand to do business in person will continue to grow. And in the longer term, younger generation will likely want to travel more and travel to longer distances, intercontinental flights. When this happens, passengers could lean more towards trusted brands and trusted airlines. And of course, since the contactless processes are already so ingrained in us, then we believe that there will be more need for digitalization and airline processes and distribution digitalization will increase. We also believe that the safety and convenience of technology may replace privacy concerns, and maybe passengers would be more willing to adopt digitalized processes to reduce physical contact. And last but not least, I have to mention that there will likely to be more intense pressure from environmental groups to reduce emissions and noise. And this is a whole new presentation, but once again, the policies that our policymakers are putting in place are super important, and I would like to remind Europeans particularly that sustainable aviation fuels will play an enormous part in there, but for that we need the right policies in place. And to have a full picture for recovery, obviously we need to look at airline and financial operations and competition. And that is really, really tough, because as I said in the beginning of the presentation, airlines are experiencing the most difficult crisis in the entire aviation history. And there are, again, many aspects to consider. And looking at the short term during the next 2 years, once again, it's very, very difficult because in the current situation, airlines would definitely need to be ramping down their operations while caring and taking care of their employees and customers, and at the same time trying to do everything to cut variable and fixed cost. And trust me, that is almost impossible task. So consolidation probably will see more M&A activity during this period. Maybe antitrust authorities and foreign ownership rules will be more flexible in future, just simply to avoid airline failures. For those that will survive the liquidity crisis, there is an opportunity to strengthen their market position. Maybe we'll also see the less clear reliance on hubs and on the historic home carrier, potential shakeup of the route networks with new carriers flying into airports, hubs which with the low utilization could create significant competition among airports to attract new carriers flying sooner. And we also see that the new COVID measures will have a significant impact on yields. Measures do cost money. There are new processes in place, sanitization, aircraft cleaning. Some airlines are providing masks, hand sanitizers to passengers and crew. Obviously, that increased cost. In some cases, airlines will need to advertise more, making sure that passengers are confident to travel. That has again impact on the yield because the cost will increase. In some things we see that maybe there will be different approach to changeable tickets and giving flexibility to travelers and revamp of frequent flyer programs. We see already today that airlines are accepting refunds, cancellations, so that is generally behavior because we just need to attract more customers. And finally, increase in debt load because to survive liquidity crisis, airlines will tap all possibilities of credit lines, and that significantly will change the landscape we are operating. And on long term, basically more than 2 years doesn't necessarily mean that it will become more simpler. In a nutshell, what has happened after COVID, that airlines most probably will not be able to do business as they were doing before crisis. If we would make money with strong intercontinental routes, that would probably not be the case. And we predict that there might be new business models arriving, bundling different packages, seeing more maybe intermodal transport offering, providing more end-to-end customer-tailored, age group-tailored travel, probably more sustainably acceptable travel bundles that probably would be demanded by the younger generation groups. We would maybe see new aviation or new airlines emerging, like conglomerates, Amazon creating an airline. So obviously that contributes to the changing environment. And in long term, we believe that governments will be much more involved in airlines because simply the state aid, we already see that state aid comes with strings attached on environment, on employment. Maybe they would want to get more, into regulation. Currently, airlines are making good portion of money from ancillaries. Maybe governments would regulate that to make sure that it is more consumer friendly. Because again of the state aids that has happened earlier, and talking about state aids and different relief measures across the globe, obviously it creates an even playing field, which will impact the way airlines operate. And lastly, it's even more stronger cost discipline. And I have to say that airlines have already done, even before crisis, quite significant task in job in managing their costs, but once again, with the increased debt and strength attached to the state aid from the governments, discipline has to be even more vigilant. So it's going to be much more focused on strengthening balance sheets, keeping debt under control, and capex will be limited probably to the core activities and not necessarily of gaining growth and market share. So again, really managing your cost. And in a nutshell, probably we'll see, unfortunately, in global level, fewer airlines, but most probably with much more stronger balance sheets. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. It's a complex road to recovery with different scenarios, different factors. Again, this is a complex time. We have never seen crises ever like this. And now, more than ever, it is important that industry and stakeholders work together, first of all, managing smartly, effectively the restrictions, work in increasing passenger confidence, which in turn will generate more demand. And as a IATA, please do count on our support. We have an excellent team in Stockholm looking after Latvia. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Hope to see you next year, but definitely in person.